How far would you go to find out the truth about someone you love, even if it means confronting someone else's darkest secrets? Holly Bennett held the large box of Christmas decorations with shaking arms as she balanced a stack of papers between her fingers. "We need more red here," he said to no one in particular, pointing with his elbow at the gigantic tree in the center of the company's hall. The sight was enchanting. Garlands hung from the chandeliers, and the sound of distant bells mingled with the gently echoing Christmas instrumental music. Employees hurried past, some dodging the decorations scattered across the floor, while others cast intrigued glances at the newly hired young woman who insisted on making everything look like Christmas magic. Up there, on the top floor of the skyscraper, Elliot Hartman glanced at the piles of reports spread out on his desk. His normally immaculate office was now an organized mess, and he knew exactly where every paper was. Still, the muffled sound of laughter coming from the hall made him look up, uncomfortable. Typical, he thought. Christmas always turned the company into a circus. With a sigh, he adjusted his glasses and went back to reviewing the contract in his hand. Meanwhile, Holly pulled the ribbon on a wreath with more force than she intended, and the sound of tearing fabric echoed through the space. "It's not possible," he grunted, while arranging the piece as best he could. One of the co-workers laughed and said no one would care. "Ah, but they will care," he replied with a mischievous smile, arranging the ornament as if it were the most important piece in the entire decoration. Upstairs, Elliot Hartman was closing his laptop with a snap, determined to avoid any confrontation with the Christmas cheer that seemed to invade every corner of the company. He adjusted his tie with an automatic gesture and walked away from the table. He needed the silence of his private library, anything that reminded him that Christmas was far from being a happy time for him. Holly, on the other hand, looked at the finely finished tree with a satisfied smile. "Now this is Christmas," he thought, ignoring the buzz around the staff too hurried to appreciate the glitter of the decorations. She knew that that tree was not just for others, but also for herself, a kind of promise that things could be better, even in that serious building. The magic of Christmas was beginning to transform the company hall, but somewhere above all those lights, someone was still trying to turn it off. The automatic elevator door opened, revealing the impeccably silent floor of the presidency. Holly Bennett held a tray of coffee with steady fingers, but her heart was beating so fast she feared the sound would be audible. She had been asked to deliver the order directly to the CEO, Elliot Hartman. The task, apparently simple, seemed like a kind of test of survival in the company, as no one dared to invade the domain of the mysterious boss. As Holly stepped out of the elevator, she felt a difference in the air. The space seemed cold, not just because of the air conditioning, but because of a kind of gravity that seemed to hang over that environment. The soft carpet muffled her footsteps, but she felt every movement ring in her head. Glass doors reflected her figure, and she realized that suddenly the security she had displayed in the entrance hall had disappeared like melting snow. When she reached the large wooden door that marked Elliot's office, she hesitated for a moment. What would he have asked for, anyway? It wasn't as if the reclusive CEO was given to common gestures. She knocked lightly, and the door opened from the inside, revealing a tall man with a rigid posture and an impassive expression. Jeremy Adams, Elliot's director of operations and right-hand man, greeted her with a professional but unwarm smile. "You can leave the coffee here," he said, pointing to a side table. "Mr. Hartman is in a meeting." Holly nodded, but something inside her compelled her to look further. Behind the large glass windows, she spotted Elliot's figure, hunched over the table. He was alone. There was no meeting. A wave of curiosity mixed with a touch of audacity rose within her. Why would someone so brilliant isolate himself like this? As he turned to leave, his eyes caught something on the edge of the side table, a small photo, almost hidden beneath a stack of papers. The image showed a young woman smiling, holding something like a wrapped gift. The expression on her face had a familiar feel to it, something that made Holly's heart race. She couldn't help but pick up the photo for a moment, just to look closer. "Bennett, anything else?" Jeremy's voice brought her back to reality, and she quickly put the photo back in place. "Nothing," he replied, a nervous smile painting his face. As he walked back to the elevator, The image of that woman never left his mind. There was something disturbingly familiar about her. Later, in the company hall, Holly couldn't concentrate. Sitting in one of the armchairs next to the Christmas tree that she had decorated with so much care, she fidgeted with her cell phone, looking for distraction. But the thoughts didn't stop. Would it be possible? Could that woman in the photo be your sister, Amelia? The memory of the last conversation he had with Amelia came flooding back. His sister, so determined to conquer the world, had disappeared from the company years before, without explanation. Holly never knew the exact reason for his abrupt departure, but now an unsettling idea was beginning to form. At the top of the building, Elliot was also stuck in thought. He got up from his chair and crossed the office, taking in the city lights. For a moment, he let his mind wander to the photo on the table. The woman's smile seemed to have greater weight in the last few days. It was like a gentle ghost, reminding him of something he would rather forget. In the distance, the muffled sound of laughter from the hall reached his ears. That Christmas was like a constant reminder of everything he tried so hard to avoid. Connections, feelings, hope. Elliot didn't know how to deal with this. Meanwhile, Holly frantically searched the company's online archive. His heart pounded as he typed Amelia Bennett's name into the search bar. The results were minimal, just a few administrative notes indicating his time at the company and his sudden departure. But one entry caught our attention. The department in which she worked was directly subordinate to the CEO. In the silence of the now empty hall, Holly decided if Elliot Hartman had anything to do with her sister's disappearance, she would find out. And nothing, not even that icy and imposing air he exuded, would stop her. Holly took a deep breath before knocking on Elliot Hartman's office door. The dark, heavy wood felt intimidating, as if every knock took courage. She knew this moment would be different. It wasn't just another coffee delivery or a message from Jeremy. This time, she had questions and an intention to get answers. With his hands still hovering in the air, he heard the deep, controlled voice coming from the other side. Between, her throat instantly dried out, but she pushed open the door. Elliot's office was a complete contrast to the cheerfully decorated hall on the ground floor. The wide windows showed the city shrouded in snow, but the interior was almost clinical. Black, gray, and white dominated the space, and the only pop of color was the blue tie Elliot wore, sitting behind his desk like a figure carved from stone. "Mr. Hartman," Holly began, trying to sound confident, but feeling the weight of his gaze resting on her. "I brought an employee feedback report on the preparations for the Christmas party." She knew it was a flimsy excuse, but it was the only way to get in without arousing suspicion. Elliot raised an eyebrow, a movement so subtle it almost went unnoticed. He gestured for her to leave the papers on the desk, but his expression was as closed as the rest of the office. He didn't expect someone to bring reports so trivially, let alone directly. "You could have left this to Jeremy," he said without looking at her, as he took the top paper from the pile. His voice was polite, but devoid of any warmth. Holly felt the impact. There was no conversation, just barriers, high and reinforced between them. However, she refused to leave without trying. "I thought I could clarify some points in person," she replied, her voice firmer than she expected, "and maybe suggest some ideas for the event, since it seems like you're not directly involved." That slightly bold comment made Elliot look up. For a moment, she noticed a flash of curiosity, but it was quickly replaced by the same neutral look as before. "I'm not involved because it's not a priority," he said, returning to the report. "But your presence here suggests that perhaps you are investing too much, Bennett." Holly felt a shiver run down her spine at the defiant tone of the last word. It was a warning, but also an invitation to retreat. She should apologize, get out of there. But something inside her refused to obey. "Well, Mr. Hartman, perhaps you should reconsider. It's Christmas after all. It's not just about work. It's about the people who make this company possible." Elliot closed the report with a dry sound, leaning slightly in his chair. He crossed his fingers on the table, looking straight at her. "And do you believe that a Christmas party solves this? That some bright lights and forgettable songs will suddenly create that connection you think is missing?" For a moment, Holly felt her confidence waver. There was something in his voice, something almost cutting, that made every word sound like an accusation. But instead of backing down, she took a deep breath. "No, I don't think the decoration is enough. I think this is just the beginning," she replied, her voice coming out calmer than she imagined. "And what exactly do you think needs to change here?" The question was direct, and Elliot's eyes were fixed on it, as if trying to decipher it. Holly felt the weight of the attention. He wasn't just listening. He was analyzing, looking for flaws. "The people," she said simply. "I think we need to care more about each other, and I believe you could lead this." For a moment, a heavy silence hovered between the two. Elliot seemed to absorb the statement, and Holly could almost hear her own heartbeat as she waited for his response. "My job is not to create emotional connections," he finally responded coldly. "My role is to ensure this company thrives." Holly swallowed. There was a hint of sadness in those words, something she hadn't expected. Elliot didn't just seem distant. He looked tired, as if that isolation was a weight he had carried for so long that it had become part of him. "Maybe it is, but emotional connections also build companies," she countered without thinking. Elliot didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood up, walking to the window. He seemed to be observing the city, but Holly had the feeling that his thoughts were far from there. "Do you have anything else to say, Bennett?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. She hesitated. There were so many things she wanted to say, so many questions she wanted to ask, but something about his posture made her stop. "No, sir. That's all." As he left, he felt a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Something was wrong there. There was more to this man than he let on, and Holly knew she was just beginning to scratch the surface. In the office, Elliot stood in front of the window, watching the snow fall. Holly's words echoed in his mind. Emotional connections build companies. He didn't know why it bothered him so much. Maybe because, somewhere inside, he knew it was true. The cold wind blew through the building's entrance, carrying snowflakes that seemed to dance to the sound of the muffled conversations in the hall. Holly Bennett adjusted her cap as she held a stack of gifts wrapped in colorful paper, her fingers beginning to lose feeling from the weight and cold. It wasn't just another day. It was the day of the charity event that she had been organizing, a mix of donating gifts to needy children and getting together for employees. When he entered the building, his energy seemed to light up the space. People stopped to greet her or simply waved from afar, recognizing the young woman who, in just a few weeks, had transformed the company into something more human. But Holly didn't have time to contemplate the results. His mind was focused on making sure everything went as planned. "You really outdid yourself this time, Bennett," Jeremy Adams said with a smile as he helped unload more gift boxes from the delivery car. His voice had an amused tone, but Holly noticed something else there. He was impressed, and it made her feel like maybe she was achieving something. Holly thanked him with a smile, but then looked away to the top of the building. He thought about Elliot Hartman, as he often did these days. He had remained distant even after the office interaction. She didn't know exactly what made her want to understand this man, but there was something about him, something that seemed trapped, waiting for a chance to break free. While preparations for the event were taking place downstairs, Elliot watched everything from his office window. The noise, although muffled by the height, seemed to echo in his mind. He saw Holly running around, arranging the tables, adjusting the decorations, and talking to everyone who crossed her path. His energy was almost tangible, a stark contrast to the orderly silence of his space. Why did she care so much? Elliot asked himself, but didn't find a satisfactory answer. He looked away to the desk where Amelia's photo still remained, partially hidden beneath a stack of papers. Something about Holly's determination reminded him of her sister, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. In the hall, the energy was high. Employees who previously barely looked at each other in the hallways now exchanged laughs and handshakes as they helped organize the donated toys. Holly moved through the space like a force of nature, encouraging each person with a smile or a word of thanks. Among the gifts, Holly found a small wooden train, hand-painted with delicate details. The memory of her childhood hit her like a bolt of lightning. Amelia loved toys like that. For a moment, she was lost in thought, holding the train with trembling fingers. Their sister had disappeared from their lives without a clear explanation. But now, looking at the building where she worked, the pieces seemed to want to fall into place. "Everything okay there, Bennett?" Jeremy asked, interrupting his thoughts. She blinked a few times before smiling. Yeah, just nostalgia. Shortly after, the event began. Children of various ages arrived accompanied by volunteers from local institutions, and the atmosphere gained a new level of joy. Holly, in her Santa hat, delivered gifts while laughing with the children and trying to make sure no one was left out. Then something unexpected happened. When she least expected it, Holly felt the environment change. She looked up and saw Elliot Hartman standing at the top of the stairs, watching everything. He wasn't wearing his usual black suit, but something more casual that made him look less intimidating. Still, his presence dominated the space, and the conversations around him subsided for a moment. Elliot descended slowly, each step feeling like a test of patience. He stopped a few feet away from Holly, taking in the organized chaos she had created. His hands were stuffed in his coat pockets, as if he were trying to protect himself, but his eyes were fixed on her. "You got this, didn't you?" he said, his voice deep but without the usual cold tone. Holly smiled, still a little surprised that he was there. "I thought you would never come down to an event like this." Elliot looked around, the slight movement of his head barely noticeable. "I'm still not sure if it was a good idea." She laughed softly, holding out a gift to him. "Well, since you're here, how about helping?" Elliot hesitated. His fingers closed around the gift, but he didn't move immediately. He looked at the small box in his hands, as if it were something completely alien. Then, finally, he stepped forward and handed the gift to a girl who was looking at him with curious eyes. Holly watched the moment with her heart racing. There was something about that simple gesture that seemed to mean so much more. Elliot, although hesitant, was there, present, and it filled her with a sense of hope that she couldn't explain. As the event continued, Elliot stayed longer than she thought possible. He didn't say much, but his presence seemed to say enough. At the end, when everyone was saying goodbye, he approached Holly. "That was interesting," he said, as if the word had been carefully chosen. Holly smiled, feeling an inexplicable warmth in her chest. "It wasn't so bad, was it?" Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the now empty hall, the remains of the event still scattered across the floor. Maybe not. Snow was falling heavily outside, covering the streets of Manhattan in a soft, luminous layer that reflected the city's Christmas lights. The corporate building, which normally seemed like a cold and intimidating monument, now had a more welcoming glow, thanks to the decorations and Christmas spirit brought by Holly Bennett. Yet to Holly, something in the air felt thick, charged. She felt like she was getting closer and closer to discovering something important about her sister, Amelia. After the charity event, Elliot Hartman's presence had become a constant in her thoughts. He was an enigma she couldn't ignore. Whenever she saw him, her mind went back to that photo she had spied the first time in his office. The image of the smiling woman still hovered in his memory, an insistent reminder that there was something unresolved. That afternoon, Holly was determined to find answers. She had discovered, almost by accident, that Amelia had worked on a confidential project directly supervised by Elliot before her abrupt departure. However, details about the project were scarce, almost as if someone had deliberately deleted them. With a mix of anxiety and boldness, Holly entered the executive floor, where the silence was almost absolute. Elliot's secretary wasn't at her desk, a perfect opportunity for her to act. She knew that Jeremy Adams, the trusty director of operations, wasn't around, which meant that, for the first time, Elliot's office seemed accessible. Upon entering, he felt the familiar pressure of the environment, as if the air there was heavier. The minimalist decor was almost suffocating, but Holly ignored that as her eyes searched for clues. The photo was no longer visible, which made her feel a mixture of relief and frustration. She opened drawers slowly, almost noiselessly, but every movement seemed to echo in her ears. In one of them, he found a folder with the inscription Aurora Project. The name was unknown to her, but something in her instinct told her it was important. As she leafed through the papers, Holly noticed that much of the information was encrypted or redacted, but one detail caught her attention. Her sister's signature appeared next to reports signed by Elliot. The sound of footsteps in the hallway froze his movements. With her heart pounding, she quickly closed the drawer and held the folder to her chest, trying to look casual. The door opened, And there he was. Elliot stopped in the doorway, his gaze immediately settling on her. "Bennett, what exactly do you think you're doing?" His voice was low, but filled with tension. Holly took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain her composure. "I was looking for a document that I thought might be here. And you thought breaking into my office was the best way to do it?" His eyebrow arched, but his eyes showed more than irritation. There was something deeper there, something she couldn't decipher. Holly held the folder tighter, like a shield. "Mr. Hartman, why is there so little information about my sister's work here?" His departure was abrupt, and no one at the company seems to know exactly why. The mention of Amelia made Elliot's eyes narrow. He took a few steps towards her, closing the door behind him. His posture was tense, as if he was trying to contain something about to explode. "Your sister was a dedicated employee," he finally replied, his voice more controlled. "She worked on an important project, but decided to pursue other paths. That's all you need to know." "That's not enough for me," Holly said, her voice shaking slightly but steady. "Amelia didn't just disappear. Something happened, and I think you know what it was." Elliot remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on her. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Bennett, your sister chose to leave. It was her decision. I can't speak for her." The words sounded convincing, but there was something in his tone that made her doubt. Holly felt a lump form in her throat, but decided not to press further for now. "I just want the truth, Mr. Hartman. Just that." He stared at her for a long moment before responding. "The truth, Bennett. Sometimes it's not as simple as you'd like it to be." With that, he took the folder from your hands and placed it back in the drawer, closing it with a click that seemed final. Holly left the office with conflicting feelings. Part of her was furious at the lack of answers, but another part felt like there was something more, something Elliot wasn't saying. And the sparkle in his eyes when he mentioned Amelia suggested it wasn't just a professional issue. Later that night, as she walked the bright streets of Manhattan, Holly thought about how her life had changed since she started working at that company. She felt like she was getting closer to the truth, but at the same time, she knew the journey would be more complicated than she imagined. At the top of his building, Elliot looked at the city with a heavy mind. The memory of Amelia weighed on him, but now there was something else that troubled him. Holly Bennett. She was as determined as her sister, and he knew he couldn't keep her at bay for long. The muffled sound of falling snow enveloped New York in an almost magical silence. But inside Holly Bennett, there was a storm. She walked through the company hall that morning with firm steps, but her mind was racing. The conversation with Elliot Hartman had left a mark on her. Something about that evasive response, that look that seemed to carry more than words could express, made his heart beat faster, and not just because of irritation. On the executive floor, Elliot was in his office but seemed unable to concentrate. His vision was fixed on the city that stretched beyond the windows, but his mind was stuck in the past. Holly's arrival had reopened wounds he had spent years trying to ignore, and now she seemed determined to extract the truth he had buried so deeply. Holly spent the morning organizing documents and trying to keep busy, but her curiosity was like an incessant insect, buzzing around her mind. When he received a notification that Elliot had a meeting outside the company, he saw an opportunity. It wasn't something she was proud of, but she needed answers. With the executive floor quieter, she climbed the stairs with her heart racing. It wasn't just about Amelia, she told herself, trying to justify her actions. It was about understanding why everything felt so fragmented, why Elliot carried that distant look, and why his sister's name felt so heavy on his lips. At the office, Holly began searching for something that could fill in the gaps. The drawers were locked, but she knew where to look. The Aurora project folder was still there, right where he had put it. This time, she went beyond the encrypted reports and found something unexpected. A letter. It was a simple note, handwritten, in handwriting that Holly recognized immediately. Amelia. His heart sank as he read the words. "Mr. Hartman, thank you for everything. This project was more than just work for me, but I think the time has come to move on. It's not an easy decision, but it's the best for me. Take care, Amelia." Holly held the paper with trembling fingers. There was something about the letter that seemed incomplete, as if the words were chosen too carefully. She couldn't imagine her sister writing something so far away. Before he could process it, he heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. She put the letter back in her briefcase and put it in its place. When the door opened, she was standing in front of Elliot. He stopped, his expression changing from surprise to something darker. "Bennett," he said, his voice low and controlled. "What are you doing here?" Holly felt the weight of his gaze, but decided not to back down. "I needed to understand. I can't ignore that something happened to my sister, and you know what it was." Elliot closed the door behind him, his face hardening. He walked slowly towards her, his hands in his coat pockets, as if he was trying to contain something. "I already told you what you needed to know. Amelia chose to leave. There is nothing else." Holly's frustration boiled over. That doesn't make sense. She was always dedicated to her work, passionate about everything she did. Why would it come out like that? Just like that? And why do you seem so affected by this? Her words hit Elliot like a punch, but he didn't let it show. He looked at her for a long moment before finally saying, "Some decisions are difficult to explain. That's not enough," cried Holly, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "I want the truth." Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When he opened them, there was something different about them, a mixture of pain and resignation. "The truth, Bennett, won't change anything." Holly took a step forward, defying the distance he kept. "But it will change for me." For a moment, the silence between them seemed to scream louder than any words. Elliot looked away, his hand involuntarily going to the table, where Amelia's photo was still hidden under papers. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "There are things you can't fix, and who decides this?" retorted Holly, her voice thick with emotion. Elliot didn't respond. He just looked at her, as if he was seeing something he hadn't seen in a long time. Finally, he said, "Leave it behind, Bennett, for yourself." But before she could respond, Jeremy appeared in the doorway, interrupting the tension. "Elliot, we need you in the conference room," he said, giving Holly a curious look. Elliot nodded and, without saying anything else, left. Holly stayed in the office for a few minutes, trying to process everything. She felt like she was close to something, but she didn't know what. And the pain in Elliot's eyes, it was almost impossible to ignore. Outside, Elliot walked down the hallway, his hands balled into fists. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long. Holly was too determined, and her every word seemed to unearth something he wanted to leave in the past. But at the same time, he couldn't deny what he felt, the need to protect her. Holly Bennett stared at Rockefeller Center's Christmas lights, but her mind was miles away. The conversation in Elliot's office had left an indelible mark, a mixture of frustration and a strange desire to understand more about him. Amelia's letter remained etched in her memory. The words sounded cold, artificial, as if they were written by someone other than his sister. Something wasn't right, and Holly was determined to find out what it was. The next day, she arrived at the company early, but not to work. Using a pretext, he obtained permission to access old files from the department where Amelia worked. It was a risky move, but she didn't care. Leafing through reports and documents, she finally found something relevant, a diary of Project Aurora notes. Next to the technical descriptions, there was a detail that made her stop, a personal memo. "I spoke with Mr. Hartman about the emotional risks of the project. He seemed genuinely concerned, but insisted on continuing." Holly's world stopped for a moment. Elliot was involved in something deeper with Amelia. Emotional risks. What did it mean? A wave of anxiety washed over her, but before she could continue investigating, a sound made her freeze. Footsteps echoing in the hallway. Holly turned and saw Elliot standing in the doorway. His gaze was intense, heavier than ever. He said nothing for a moment, letting the silence speak for him. Then, in a serious tone, he said, "I knew you wouldn't give up." She held the diary tightly, feeling a mixture of guilt and determination. "Maybe if you had been honest from the beginning, I wouldn't have had to do this." Elliot entered the archive, closing the door behind him. His shoulders were tense, as if carrying the weight of something he had long tried to hide. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice lower. "So explain it to me, Elliot," replied Holly, abandoning the formalities. He was silent for a long moment, before finally sitting in a nearby chair. He ran his hands over his face, as if he tried to find words he didn't mean. "Amelia was different," he began, his voice loaded with emotion. She had a passion for work that surpassed anyone I've ever seen. But she too, he took everything to the personal side. Holly leaned forward, feeling that he was about to say something important. Keep going. Elliot looked at her, her eyes revealing something Holly had never seen before. Vulnerability. The Aurora project was something big, ambitious, but it was also risky. It required long hours, difficult decisions, sacrifices. Amelia dived headlong. I tried to protect her, but she didn't want to hear. Protect her from what? Holly asked, the voice loaded with emotion. From herself, she answered Elliot, her voice almost a whisper. She charged herself too much, assumed responsibilities that were not hers, and when things started to go wrong, she blamed herself. Holly felt a knot form in her throat. And what did you do? I did what I thought I needed to be done, answered Elliot, his voice hardening. I told her that I needed to leave, which was not worth destroying itself for a job. Did you force her out? Holly asked incredulously. I gave her a choice, said Elliot, looking away. She chose to leave. For a moment, Holly didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to scream, accuse him of being responsible for her sister's suffering. But another part, I saw the pain in your eyes. Elliot was not an insensitive man. He was clearly carrying a burden, something that was destroying him inside. And why did you never tell me that before? She asked finally. Because I thought it would be better for you not to know, answered Elliot. But now I see that you won't stop until you understand everything. Holly felt the tears come, but held them. The truth was more complex than she imagined. Elliot was not the villain she thought, but wasn't innocent either. He had tried to protect Amelia, but in the process he had lost control of the situation. When he finally left the file, Holly felt exhausted, but also relieved. She knew more now, but there was still something that bothered her. Elliot's eye pain was not just guilt, it was something deeper, something she still didn't completely understand. At the top of the building, Elliot remained alone, staring at the city while the night fell. He knew he had been very close to the truth with Holly, and I knew that from that moment, nothing would be the same between them. The night fell on Manhattan, bringing with it a silence that contrasted with the vibrant lights and the sounds of the city. Holly Bennett was sitting on her small apartment's couch, looking at Amelia's letter she had scanned at work. The words were recorded in his mind, but something still looked out of place. She had finally obtained some answers from Elliot Hartman, but the truth didn't leave her alone. She squeezed the tea mug between her hands, the heat helping to push the cold that seemed to have lodged inside her since the conversation with Elliot. Her words echoed in her mind. I tried to protect her. I gave her a choice. But what did that really mean? Was he failed to protect her, or worse, contributed to what happened? Holly closed her eyes, trying to soothe the emotions that robbed her. The pain for the loss of Amelia, the anger at so many unanswered questions, and something more, something she didn't want to admit, the growing concern for Elliot. She had seen one side of him that few, or maybe no one knew. A broken man, fighting demons he had created himself. In the office, Elliot stared at the snow falling through the window. He felt empty, as if something essential had been torn from inside him. The conversation with Holly had messed with him in ways he couldn't describe. She was relentless, determined, but there was also a fragility in her that made him disconcerted. He knew he had injured Amelia, but the idea that she was having the same impact on Holly was unbearable. Why don't you just forget me, Bennett? He murmured to himself, as if his words could push her presence away from his mind. But Holly was not someone easy to forget. She was like a storm, invading his space with her energy, her passion, and her incessant search for the truth. And as much as Elliot wanted to move away, something in him pulled him back. The next day, Holly arrived early on the company, but not to resume work normally. She knew she needed to confront Elliot again. The answers he had given were not enough, and she was determined to go to the end, even if it meant risking the little relationship they had built. Climbing his executive walking, he felt his heart beat faster. Elliot's office door was open, something rare, and she saw him standing by the window, hands in her pockets and tense shoulders. He looked lost in thoughts, and for a moment she hesitated. But then he gathered his courage. He knocked lightly on the door and entered. Elliot turned slowly, her tired look finding hers. Bennett, he began, his voice lower than usual. "What do you need now?" Holly closed the door behind him, crossing his arms. "I need to understand. I need to know why you look like you carry this weight, as if it were your guilt." Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You really won't stop, are you?" "No," replied Holly, firm, "because this is not just about Amelia. It's about you too." Those words disarmed him. Elliot sat, looking at his own hands for a moment before starting to speak. "I failed," he said finally. "No matter how much I try to justify, the truth is that I failed. Amelia was brilliant, but I pushed her into a project that was too big. She wanted to give up before, but I insisted, thinking she would overcome. When I realized she was on the edge, it was too late." Holly felt a tightness in her chest, but remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I saw how she worn out, but instead of helping her out before, I tried to motivate her, how I do it with everyone. I didn't realize she was different. When I finally told her to leave, she was already broken." Elliot looked up at Holly, and the vulnerability in her gaze surprised her. "I thought I was doing my best for her, but in the end she left here feeling she had failed." Holly felt the tears sprout, but flashed quickly to contain them. She didn't know if she felt angry or pity. He had really tried, but had failed in a way that had cost too much. "Why did you never tell me that before?" she asked, her voice failing. "Because I thought it would be easier for you to hate me," answered Elliot, your voice loaded with pain. For a moment, the silence between them seemed overwhelming. Holly wanted to scream at him, to blame him, but she also wanted to comfort him, to say that he was not alone in that weight. And this duality consumed her. "I can't change what happened, Bennett," said Elliot finally, "but I can say that it does not spend a day without my regret of what I did." Holly took a deep breath, trying to process everything he had heard. Finally, she said, "Amelia was never the type of person who kept grudge. I think she would have forgiven you." Elliot looked away, but did not answer. He knew Amelia's forgiveness would never come, but Holly's, maybe there was a chance. When Holly left the office, she felt as if something had changed between them. The distance that existed before it seemed shorter now, but the weight of the truth was still there. She knew it wouldn't be easy to move on, but she was willing to try. At the top of the building, Elliot returned to the window, watching the snow fall. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something different hope. New York's sky was covered with gray clouds, foreshadowing more snow. Holly Bennett walked slowly through the busy streets, regardless of the cold that bit her face. His encounter with Elliot Hartman was still fresh in his mind like a persistent echo. The pain in his eyes, the confession loaded with guilt, and the admission that he had failed with Amelia messed with her more than she would like to admit. As he climbed into the elevator of the company building, his hands held something he had found the night before. A notebook, worn out of time, which belonged to Amelia. He had been found among the boxes of belongings that his mother had kept after his sudden departure. Holly had flipped her pages for hours, and each word seemed a whisper of her sister, bringing memories and a new understanding. She entered the executive floor with hesitant steps. Elliot's office door was open, and he was at the table, concentrated on a pile of reports. His face looked more tired, as if the weight of recent weeks were finally reflected in his appearance. He looked up when he saw her, and for a moment, something soft went through his expression before he regained his usual mask. "Bennett," he said, his low voice, "any problems?" Holly came in, holding the notebook firmly. "It's not a problem, but it's something you need to see." Elliot tilted his head slightly, intrigued. He gestured for her to sit, but Holly remained standing, as if the severity of the moment prevented her from relaxing. "I found this yesterday," she started, putting the notebook on his table. "It is Amelia's diary." The air in the room seemed to change. Elliot looked at the object like a living thing, something that could hurt him. Carefully, he took the notebook and began to flip his pages. Amelia's words were there, recording thoughts, feelings, and reflections. For several minutes, Holly was silent, watching him as he read. Her eyes moved slowly on the pages, and she saw how her expression changed from curiosity to something darker, until finally he stopped on a specific page. "She wrote about you," said Elliot, her almost inaudible voice. Holly nodded. "She admired you, you know. After all, she thought you believed in her more than anyone else." Elliot closed the notebook, but remained holding it, as if it were something precious. I believed, he admitted, but I failed to show it the right way. Holly felt a knot in her throat. As much as he wanted to blame Elliot, the truth was that he was suffering too. He had lost something important, just like her. She wrote something else, said Holly, taking the notebook and opening on a marked page. Read. Elliot took the notebook back, his eyes scanning the words. Amelia had written about her last day at the company, mentioning how Elliot had encouraged her to leave to preserve her mental health. But what hit him deeply was the last line. I don't blame Elliot. He tried to do what was right. Maybe one day he can forgive himself. Elliot closed his eyes, as if the words had reached something he had been keeping for years. When he opened them again, there were tears in them, something Holly never imagined seeing. She never blamed you, Holly said, her soft but firm voice, and you need to stop carrying it alone. Elliot shook his head slowly, trying to soothe. For so long, I thought that the failure was everything she saw in me. She saw the effort, replied Holly, and the respect you had for her. The silence between them was filled by the distant sound of the city's traffic. Finally, Elliot looked up at Holly. Thank you, he said simply. Holly smiled slightly, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. It was not easy to get here, but something in it knew that they had overcome the hardest barrier. Later, that night, Elliot came down to Hall for the first time since the charity event. Holly was there, adjusting the lights of the big Christmas tree. He watched her for a moment before he finally said, "You managed to turn this place." She turned, surprised, but smiled. I think it was something that needed to be done. He nodded and for the first time seemed relaxed, almost human. Thank you for not giving up, he said. I never give up, replied Holly, his smile gaining a softer shine. The streets of New York were more alive than ever, with Christmas just a few days away. The city seemed to have been painted by hand with bright lights, decorated showcases, and the contagious joy that hovered in the air. Holly Bennett climbed the steps of Rockefeller Center, the snowflakes sticking to her hair as the cold wind cut her face. But she didn't care. Inside there was something warmer than any fireplace could provide. In the heart of the center, the famous Christmas tree shone like a lighthouse of hope. Holly stopped in front of her, deeply inspiring the cold air. The last weeks had been an emotional roller coaster. She had come to the company with the intention of seeking answers about Amelia, but went out with something she could never have predicted. Holly heard steps behind her. When he turned, he found Elliot Hartman. He was without his usual impeccable suit. Instead, he wore a heavy coat and a navy scarf, and for a moment he looked more human than ever. You came, Holly said, with a warm smile. Elliot stopped by her side, sticking her hands in her pockets. You insisted, he answered, but there was a touch of humor in his voice, something rare and precious. They were silent for a few minutes, both looking at the tree. The light reflected in Elliot's eyes revealed a serenity that Holly had not seen before. Finally, he broke the silence. I haven't been here since I was a child, he said. My mother loved this place. She said that somehow these lights made everything possible. Holly looked at him, surprised by the confession. Do you believe this? I don't know, he answered, but today, maybe. She felt her heart tighten with vulnerability in her voice. Elliot was no longer the closed inmate man who had found weeks ago. He was opening, piece by piece, and she knew she had played an important role in it. Holly took something out of his coat pocket, Amelia's notebook. I think she would like you to stay with it, he said, giving him to him. Elliot hesitated for a moment before accepting the notebook. He ran his fingers through the cover as if it were sacred. Thank you, he said, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel that the moment was more significant than any word could express. You are not alone in this, Elliot, said Holly, his soft but firm voice, and it was never. Elliot looked away for a moment, absorbing her words. Then he turned his gaze to Holly, and there was something different about him, something lighter. You are not, he said finally. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The city, the snow, the lights around all disappeared, leaving only both there, sharing something that transcended words. Holly smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't felt for years. Amelia was at peace, she knew that now. And perhaps, just maybe, she was also finding her own peace. Elliot stepped ahead, her fixed eyes on hers. You have changed a lot, Bennett. You too, she said, her firm but soft voice. more than imagine. He laughed softly and for the first time seemed genuine. The sound made her smile even more. While the lights of the tree blinked around them, Elliot reached out, not as a formal gesture, but something deeper, an invitation. Holly hesitated for a moment before accepting her, feeling his warmth against the cold air. They stood there side by side as the city continued to rotate around them. Nothing needed to be said. All that mattered was at that moment, in the silent promise that together they could face anything that came. And when the snow fell stronger, covering New York with its white cover, Holly realized that, just as winter eventually gave in to the heat of spring, people could also change. And that love, in all its forms, was the true miracle of Christmas.